This video is sponsored by Movie Palette. Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Sosie Bacon is haunted by the spectre of a terrifying smile. Therapist Dr. Rose Cotter, played by Sosie Bacon, speaks to a patient named Laura Weaver, played by Caitlin Stacey, who claims that she is being tormented by a smiling entity, who then suddenly becomes possessed and slits her throat in front of Rose. Traumatized by the event, Rose now starts to see visions of the same smiling entity that haunts her and destroys her life. Rose begins to uncover a chain of violent deaths, all linked by the same entity, that all died within a week of the last, and must find a way of defeating it before she becomes the next. Smile is the feature debut of director Parker Finn, who made quite a splash on the festival circuit 2 years ago with his short film Laura Hasn't Slept. That premiered at South by Southwest in 2020, and the original 11-minute short featured Caitlin Stacey as a woman named Laura that claimed that she was being pursued by a smiling menace. Stacey essentially reprised her role for this feature film version, but the executives at Paramount saw the original short and actually hired Finn to expand it into a full-length movie. And the original intent behind Smile was actually to release it digitally on Paramount+. But when Paramount actually test screened it for audiences, the results were so high they realised that they had a sleeper hit on their hands. So they took the movie, which was originally shot under the title of There's Something Wrong with Rose, to kind of spiritually continue the naming of the short, even though it massively expanded beyond that, and just brought it down to the much punchier Smile, and have given it a full theatrical release, and that shows a lot of confidence in a movie which doesn't really have any stars in it, just the genre and a good hook. And believe me, their confidence is well founded, because this has plenty for horror fans to be happy about. Smile isn't really knowable for what it is so much as how it's executed. On the face of it, Smile can be very simply described as The Ring meets It Follows. In fact, the scene where Laura describes a smiling entity to Rose has some dialogue that's strikingly familiar to the latter movie. The way that she explains how it can impersonate people, both living and dead, both strangers and family, and the fact that the cursed are the only ones that can see these people. But the thing is, those aren't bad points of reference to be taking ideas from. Even the smile gimmick is not original, because just a few years ago, Blumhouse's Truth or Dare had possessed people that smiled when they did so in a very creepy, sinister way, in exactly the same kind of fashion that Smile does. But the thing is, in Truth or Dare, they knew it was a creepy image, but it was kind of disconnected from everything else that was going on in the movie. But in Smile, it does actually serve something of a purpose. Smile is definitely derivative. It's not going to be winning originality points anytime soon, but it takes those kind of points of reference and manages to craft something kind of interesting out of it nevertheless, especially because the concept at the basis of Smile is basically an exploration of mental health. The central Smile gag almost seems like a riff on this idea of it's okay to not be okay. This idea that people are going around in their daily, everyday lives pretending to other people that everything is alright, when the reality is they're an absolute mess, barely keeping things together, but they've got a mask on. They've put on a happy face. The movie even literally evokes this with a very brief scene where Rose stands in front of a mirror and practices her best fake smile before she goes to her nephew's birthday party, because she doesn't actually want to go, especially because she has a strained relationship with her sister, and also because by this point her life is already starting to fall apart. Rose keeps pretending like this isn't happening to her, like this is just some form of PTSD from the incident, but then it starts trying to dismantle her life and especially disrupt her social systems that she set up for her daily everyday life. So in that way, each instance of the smile becomes like a taunt that becomes more threatening with each repetition, especially with the promise of violence. So through that lens, the entity becomes a metaphor for mental illness, and the movie uses imagery related to the subject extensively. In fact, I would say that if you're sensitive to it, you might want to give the movie a miss. Early on, Rose meets one of her regular patients who is just riddled with anxiety about death, muttering to himself, I'm gonna die, she's gonna die, they're gonna die, everything's worthless, everything's hopeless, and he's just consumed with nihilism. But in a way, it's almost a sentiment the movie itself seems to share, especially once Rose becomes cursed, because she is aware that she now has an expiration date. She is going to die sooner rather than later. That is part of the absolute fear of the concept, just knowing that you are about to die, and the increasing absolute despair at that realization. And there's a reason why the entity keeps taking the form of that particular patient, so it can just mockingly tell her to Rose's face, you're going to die. And the more that Rose goes through the movie, the more that she starts manifesting symptoms of her own patients, or at least appearing to. There's a moment where Rose actually crashes through a glass table and rather unfortunately gets lacerations on her wrist that require bandages that look suspiciously like something else, if you get what I mean. And that's the kind of thing that Smile is playing around with, this idea that she's not actually going crazy, there is something attacking her, but everyone else thinks that she's losing touch with reality, and maybe in some senses she is. But the movie is also very much about trauma, the way the Smile Demon passes on through people witnessing what it does to its victims, in a way imprinting itself upon the mind like a traumatic event, through the unforgettably horrible. And while people aren't being literally attacked by their trauma like they are in this movie, you can definitely see the allegory in that Rose is trying to live her life when suddenly there'll be a trigger and she'll completely collapse, and no one seems to understand what is going on inside her mind except her. And this is cemented by a key subplot involving her mother, who was an addict that had an overdose. In fact, this is the very first thing that we see at the start of the movie, and she saw that as a child, and this is something that she's still not properly come to terms with. She still has vivid dreams about the event, but she has carefully constructed her entire life to avoid looking inwards at herself and truly examining that. She overworks herself deliberately so that she doesn't have to spend time looking at her own life. And when the entity takes all of those systems away from her and takes her job away from her, suddenly she starts to reassess all that. And as the film progresses, confronting that childhood trauma and her residual feelings of guilt that still linger, and confronting the Smile entity that's coming to kill her, become one and the same. Sosie Bacon is excellent in the lead role. The daughter of Kevin Bacon and Kyra Sedgwick, she very much continues the proud family tradition of starring in messed up horror movies. But she's in virtually every single scene of this film. Almost the entire film takes place from Rose's perspective, so she gets a lot of screen time to very slowly pull apart Rose as a character. When we meet her at the very beginning of this movie, she's almost clinical. She's considered and ordered. And you can see this in her attire as well. Very professional, buttoned up, even her hair is done up. And then, over the course of the movie, the hair comes down, the dress sense becomes looser and looser, and more erratic, along with her personality. She tries to take on this entity with her psychiatric training and trying to keep herself composed, but every so often she'll just lash out impulsively. She'll suddenly curse out and just really let these feelings come out from inside of her that she's tried to repress for so long. And you get that sense that she is facing these fears and these anxieties that she has tried to quash for so long, and they're all rushing back up to the surface, and it's such a nuanced and layered performance that elevates up the material. She enhances the dramatic aspects of the movie through her performance, and in turn, that makes them much richer and makes the movie better. It's also well worth mentioning Caitlin Stasey, even though she's pretty much out of the movie by the time the title even appears, but she has her one major scene and absolutely makes it count. There's a reason why Finn kept her from the original short. It's because she's fantastic, and she brings so much to this role, even though she has a very limited amount of screen time. But this is a pivotal scene, and the way that she brings so many little ticks and nuances, the kind of nervousness that gives way into absolute hysteria, and she's having to describe something that we haven't seen yet, but she brings so much fear to the table, but also kind of makes it rational. You kind of understand why she feels like that, and then when the character becomes possessed, that's when the performance truly becomes unforgettable. In fact, that entire opening scene pretty much sets a bar for the entire rest of the movie to follow, because after that point, the entire audience is on edge. There is absolutely a reason why Stacey's face is on all the posters for this movie, even though she's hardly even in it. Which brings us to Parker Finn's direction, which is remarkably assured for a debut. Yes, the material itself might be familiar, but the direction is brilliant. Finn clearly knows his horror. He knows how to draw tension and suspense, and actually Smile is a bit of a slower burn than you might suspect, but when the big jump scares arrive, he also knows that a good one is like a magic trick. He makes you look one way, kind of suspect the obvious jump scare, and then surprises you from behind. It's actually kind of a shame that Paramount's marketing has cut together a lot of the bigger moments in the movie, because those really would have worked without them being spoiled all over the trailers, but nevertheless, they're still effective, and they still make audiences absolutely jump out of their seats. In fact, the movie is quite beautifully shot. Shout out to the cinematographer Charlie Saroff, because there are really memorable establishing shots and quite ambitious moments of cinematography. There's moments where the camera deliberately pans itself upside down to evoke the kind of warped smile all throughout the movie. But one of the shots that really stuck out of my mind comes very early in the movie, where Laura is being loaded out of an ambulance, and we see this being shot directly down to the ground from a very high angle, and then the camera moves up and then moves through a window into the hospital to follow Rose as she walks into a room. That's a crazy ambitious, almost David Fincher style shot in a movie that was originally destined to be on streaming. What I will say though is maybe that Finn is a bit overly enamoured with these establishing shots, because at times it does feel like he lingers on them to the extent where it actually detracts from the movie's pacing, and I do think that Smile perhaps would have benefited from just a slight tightening up in that regard. Its almost 2-hour running time could have easily lost 10 minutes without sacrificing anything. And Smile is a very aggressive horror film. It does not shy away from the gore, nor does it shy away from being nasty or mean-spirited. In fact, there's one gag that definitely stuck out in my mind involving a birthday party, which is so cruel in its punchline. It almost comes back around to being dark comedy, but it also manages to be shocking in its own right. It is a really disturbing moment, and Finn crafts many of those all throughout the movie. Certainly, he knows how to make an image really get under your skin. I do think the second half of the movie is less engaging than the first because it leans less on those mental health themes and more towards the procedural. Again, you can really feel the influence of The Ring on this particular portion of the movie as Rose races around to all available leads trying to figure out the mythology of what's chasing after her. Although, full credit to Finn, he doesn't feel the need to over-explain his monster. He doesn't give it a backstory or explain where it came from or what its motivations is because he doesn't need to. It is an unknowable evil, and that is what makes it terrifying. Although I do think if they end up franchising this, that may end up being one of the first things to go. But while you're watching it, it does feel like Rose is just going from one scene of exposition to the next, basically. And it's also where the most kind of narrative and logic gaps start to appear, particularly when she gets her ex-boyfriend, a detective, involved in trying to help her with all this. And the fact that he's a detective who was already assigned to her case and hadn't already noticed the death chain for himself, just simply by looking up the leads of what happened to all of the witnesses, the fact they all died in very quick succession, that should have been immediately obvious, but somehow Rose is the first one to actually uncover this. But while this portion of the movie is definitely more conventional, it is at least in line by the fact that Smile has a solid roster of character actors at its disposal. It probably has the most, hey, it's that guy types I've seen in quite some time, and certainly they managed to make an impression, even though they only pop up for maybe a scene or two at a time. So you've got Jesse T. Usher from The Boys as Rose's partner, who is perhaps less understanding than he could be. You've got Cal Penn as Rose's boss, who is genuinely worried about her psyche. You've got Robin Weigart as Rose's psychiatrist, and in fairly brief appearances, you've got Judy Reyes, aka Carlot from Scrubs, who plays the wife of a previous Smile victim, and you've also got Rob Morgan in just one scene as an incarcerated banker who seems to have slipped through the death chain somehow. And again, that scene is very well acted for what is meant to be a crucial bit of exposition. And these kind of character actor types, again, grounds the movie, and that helps elevate the material even further. Unfortunately, the movie does succumb to the standard horror movie motions, particularly as it moves towards the ending, which I have to admit I felt a little bit let down by in some ways. I genuinely expected the movie to have another trick up its sleeve. I thought it was going to throw another twist at the audience to surprise me instead of going for the obvious ending. But alas, that's exactly where it was heading. There is an attempt at a twist very late into the movie, but I have to be honest, I've seen that done in so many horror films over the years that I saw it coming from a mile away, especially because it's not even very convincing in its fake out, especially if you're so familiar with the genre. And I think that when you read the movie through its mental health lens, it makes the ending even darker unnecessarily. I think the movie kind of forgets about that as it moves towards the ending, especially because I genuinely think that a more cathartic finish would have actually been a bit more satisfying and earned in relation to that, whereas the movie just kind of ends on the most disturbing note that it can think of. That being said, when the Smile monster does finally make its appearance on screen, it is memorably disgusting, especially because it's designed by the effects maestros of Alec Gillis and Tom Woodruff Jr., who have plenty of experience in that kind of thing, having worked on movies like Aliens. Smile could have done with having a more unconventional finish instead of just having the same standard horror movie ending I've seen about 1,000 times before. Smile will definitely put one on the faces of horror fans. I think this will become a breakout hit that will perform very strongly all the way through to Halloween. I think it kind of splits the difference between a mainstream popcorn horror movie with plenty of jump scares and maybe a more thoughtful, cerebral A24 type horror movie. It's kind of that roller coaster ride, but with a bit more substance than you'd usually expect from a studio horror film, and it's definitely a great debut debut for Parker Finn. I do think his direction is a bit better than his writing, which kind of feels like a grab bag of various familiar horror elements, and I do have some misgivings about the second half of the movie, particularly the ending, but nevertheless, his helming is what makes the movie rise above feeling derivative, and Smile definitely has full command over its audience. I don't think I've seen a horror movie have its audience in the palm of its hand like this since the time I saw Sinister on opening weekend, and like that movie, it feels vicious, scary, and genuinely unnerving, and I think this cements Finn as definitely being a director to watch in the future. You know what makes me smile? This is a movie palette. Imagine the colour tones of your favourite movie rendered as a piece of art. In this case, this is Terminator 2 Judgment Day, and looking at all of these lines, you can almost see the movie in your mind's eye as you're looking at it. I think that's really cool, and if you would like a movie palette of your own, then go to moviepalette.com and use the code FilmBrain15 to get 15% off, and that will really make you smile. If you like this review and you want to support my work, you can give me a tip at my Ko-fi page, or with YouTube's Super Thanks feature, which is right below the video, or you can buy some of my merch from my TeePublic page, or you can really make me smile over at my Patreon, where you can see my videos early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.